Welcome all my Patreon subscribers and fellow Bereans. Today I'm continuing with my study of John Gill's commentary, particularly to do with Antichrist and the fourth kingdom of Daniel. For that, I'll turn to John Gill's commentary, starting with Daniel chapter 7, verse 7. For those of you who don't know anything about John Gill, if you haven't listened to my previous messages, you might not know that John Gill was a prominent 18th century theologian. He was a Baptist preacher and a formidable intellect. He had mastered all the Roman classics by the time he was 11 years old. Anyway, if you want more information about John Gill, that's something you can Google, or you can go back and listen to my previous messages. So without further ado, let's get started on John Gill's commentary, starting with Daniel chapter 7, verse 7. He says, "After this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a fourth beast." Gill then says, "Not in another night, as Jarkey, but in the same night." What Gill is saying there is Jarkey, who was a Jewish commentator, also known as Rashi, had commented that the fourth beast vision was on a different night. And Gill is simply saying, no, but in the same night. So Gill goes on to say, and in the same vision of it. Only after he had seen the other three successively. Then last of all he saw this fourth beast. And more being said of this than the rest, shows that this was the principal thing in the vision to be observed, and being to endure until, and having a close connection with the kingdom of the Messiah. Now this is important because not only is there more written about the fourth beast, Daniel himself was particularly curious about the fourth beast. He inquired specifically of the fourth beast, but not of the others. And so that's in keeping with what John Gill is saying. This is the important part of this vision, of this prophecy. And so that's what we're going to focus on. We're not going to concern ourselves with the first three beasts. It's the fourth beast that seems to be the center of attention. And I believe for us today, as Christians, that is the most relevant beast. And as Gill says, relevant to the kingdom of the Messiah. Gill goes on to say, which arising, speaking of the Messiah, shall destroy it and take place of it. Then Gill qualifies, this is not the Turkish Empire, as Aben Ezra. Aben Ezra was a commentator that said the Turkish Empire was the fourth kingdom. Gill goes on to say, nor the kingdom of the Seleucidae, as Grotius. Grotius was another commentator, and he said that the fourth kingdom was that of the Seleucids. And so Gill says, and there were others making these kinds of claims. But then he qualifies why their claims are not valid. He writes, to which neither the characters nor the duration of it agree. And so Gill references Gorionitis saying the following, dreadful and terrible, and strong exceedingly, exceeding powerful, as the Roman Empire was, and terrible to all the kingdoms of the earth, its armies, wherever they came, struck terror among the nations, and threw them into panic, killing, wasting, robbing all they met with. And especially it was terrible for Christians, by their persecutions of them, as both Rome pagan and Rome papal have been. Rome has its name from strength with the Greeks, and from height with the Hebrews. As Jerome observes, it had great iron teeth, which may design its generals and emperors, such as Scipio, Pompey, Julius Caesar, and others, which crushed and devoured all that came in their way. This monarchy answers to the legs and feet of iron in Nebuchadnezzar's dream. It devoured and brake into pieces, and stamped the residue with the feet of it. It devoured nations, broke kingdoms into pieces, and brought them into subjection to them, reducing them to the greatest servitude, and obliging them to pay heavy taxes and tribute. Now I'll pause for a moment and comment briefly on what Gill just said. Gill is describing specifically the Roman Empire, and he's making very little distinction between pagan Rome and papal Rome, insisting that both were equally guilty of the same thing. And essentially, this is the same empire of Rome under a different structure, under a different kind of ecclesial and temporal power. That would be papal Rome. Gill goes on to say, it was diverse from all the beasts that were before it, in its original language, laws, customs, and forms of government. It was such a monster that no name could be given it. There was no one beast in nature to which it could be compared. It had all the properties of the other beasts for craft, cruelty, oppression, and tyranny. And therefore, John describes this same beast as being like a leopard, having the feet of a bear and the mouth of a lion. Revelation 13, verse 2. And it had 10 horns, which are explained of 10 kings or kingdoms. Daniel 7:24. The same with the 10 toes of Nebuchadnezzar's dream, and with the 10 kings that received power as kings, with the beast, or 10 kingdoms, into which the Roman Empire was divided about the time of the rise of Antichrist. And that ends John Gill's commentary of verse 7. We'll now move on to verse 8. Gill begins, I considered the horns, the 10 horns of the fourth beast. These the prophet particularly looked at, took special notice of them, carefully observed them, their number, form, and situation, and pondered in his mind what should be the meaning of them. And behold, while he was attentive to these and thinking within himself what they should be, something still more wonderful presented. There came up among them another little horn, not Titus Vespasian, as Jerachi, nor the Turkish Empire, as Sadia, or Antiochus Epiphanes, as many Christian interpreters. For not a single person or king is meant by a horn, but a kingdom or a state, and a succession of governors. I should just pause for a moment and say that Jerachi and Sadia were commentators that Gill sometimes references. He continues, for not a single person or king is meant by a horn, but a kingdom or state, and a succession of governors, as by the other 10 horns are meant 10 kings or kingdoms. Besides, this little horn is part of the fourth, and not the third beast, to which Antiochus belonged, and was to rise up not in the third or Grecian monarchy, as he did, but in the fourth and Roman monarchy, and was to continue until the spiritual coming of Christ, or until his kingdom, in a spiritual sense, takes place. Now I differ a little bit with Gill here. He seems to focus on the spiritual coming of Christ and not the physical coming of Christ. I think in retrospect, as history has moved on from the day of Gill, that is the 18th century, we see a little bit more clearly that there is a coming of Christ that is physical. There is both the spiritual and physical coming of Christ. The idea of the spiritual coming and the physical coming is really what we're looking at when Christ returns and finishes this business of Antichrist. Gill continues, and since no other has appeared in the Roman Empire to whom the characters of this horn agree, but Antichrist, or the Pope of Rome, he may well thought to be intended. Irenaeus, a Christian writer who lived in the 2nd century, interprets it of Antichrist, of whom, having said many things, has these words. I'll read those words of Irenaeus in a minute, but I want to just quickly reference something in my book, Antichrist, the Smoke of Rome. Irenaeus was not the only early church leader that spoke of the Roman Empire being replaced by another empire that would be essentially the Roman Empire, but different, but would be in fact Antichrist. And in my book, Antichrist, the Smoke of Rome, I dedicate a number of chapters where I quote the early church fathers. For example, Tertullian, Hippolytus, Cyprian, and Irenaeus all agreed that whatever replaced pagan Rome would be the Antichrist and the Antichrist dynasty, and that continues to be taught even after the Nicene Council. Men such as Cyril of Jerusalem, John Chrysostom, and Augustine of Hippo all taught the same doctrine. Antichrist was what came out of the Roman Empire, what replaced it, and there's only one candidate, and that is Papal Rome. Now it's important that John Gill references Irenaeus, because Irenaeus was a pupil of Polycarp. Polycarp was a pupil of John, the Apostle John. We know that Polycarp got his doctrine from John, and we know Irenaeus got his doctrine from Polycarp, and all three consistently taught the same principle. Rome would be replaced by Antichrist, but Antichrist would come out of Rome, and Antichrist would come out of the church. It would be this amalgamation of what was the Roman Empire and the church. Let me return now to Gill's commentary and read what he quoted from Irenaeus. John the disciple of the Lord in Revelation hath yet more manifestly signified of the last time, and of those 10 kings in it, among whom the empire that now reigns, the Roman Empire, that's who reigned at the time of Irenaeus, shall be divided, declaring what shall be the 10 horns, which were seen by Daniel, saying, The 10 horns which thou sawest are 10 kings, which have received no kingdom as yet. Therefore it is manifest that of these he that is to come shall slay 3, and the rest shall be subject to him, and he shall be the 8th among them. Unquote. Gill says, and Jerome on the place says, that this is the sense of all ecclesiastical writers, that when the Roman Empire is destroyed, there shall be 10 kings, who shall divide it among them, and an 11th shall arise, a little king, who shall conquer 3 of the 10 kings, and having slain them, the other 7 shall submit their necks to the conqueror. Unquote. Gill then says, who he further observes is not a devil or demon, but a man, the man of sin, and son of perdition. So here we have Gill clearly referencing the very early church teachings on the emergence of Antichrist, the man of sin, and the son of perdition. And Gill confirms that this is what Irenaeus taught, and Jerome taught, and of course the others that I mention in my book, Antichrist, the Smoke of Rome. Then Gill says, so that he dare to sit in the temple of God, making himself as if he was God. Now to the Roman Antichrist, everything here said answers. In other words, everything that Paul said in 2 Thessalonians about the man of sin and the son of perdition fits the Roman Pope to a T, and every Pope. Gill then says, he is a horn possessed of power, strength, authority, and dominion, of which the horn is an emblem, a little one which rose from small beginnings, and came to his ecclesiastic power from a common pastor or bishop. Gill is teaching us the very idea that John writes about when he says Antichrist will come out of the church. John said, "Even now there are many antichrists. They went out from us because they were not of us." And this is the idea Gill is reflecting upon, that small beginning. They came from common pastors within the church. This is true of the popes. Gill then goes on to say, to be a metropolitan of Italy, and then universal bishop, and to his secular power, which at first was very small. Now this is really important, because Antichrist must be equally ecclesial and political, not just one or the other. This was the teaching of the early church, and this was the teaching of the reformers. This is what Gill is commenting on. This was the historic teaching of the church from the beginning. He then says, which at first was very small, and since increased, and yet in comparison of the other horns or kingdoms, but little, though being allowed to exercise a power within others, is, or at least has been, very formidable. This came up among the other horns. When the northern barbarous tribes broke into the empire and set up 10 kingdoms in it, this little horn sprung up among them, and while they were forming kingdoms for themselves, he was contriving one for himself. They rose at the same time, and reigned together, before whom there were 3 of the first horns plucked up by the roots, before whom 3 kings or kingdoms fell, and were subdued, as in Daniel chapter 7 verse 20, which according to Mr. Meade, another commentator, were the kingdoms of the Greeks, of the Longobards, and of the Franks. But according to Sir Isaac Newton, they were the Exarchate of Ravenna. The Exarchate of Ravenna was an eastern part of the Roman Empire between the 6th and 8th centuries, and the kingdom of the Lombards, as Gill writes here. Continuing with Gill, and the Senate and Dukedom of Rome, or according to the present Bishop of Clover, the Campagna of Rome, the Exarchate of Ravenna, and the region of Pentapolis, which were plucked up by Pippin and Charlemagne, kings of France, and given to the Pope. So here we have an account of what actually happened historically, how these kingdoms fell, were subdued, and given over to the Pope, just as the Scripture prophesied. And then Gill writes, and they were confirmed to him by their successor, Louis the Pious. Louis the Pious was the king of France in the 8th and 9th centuries. Gill continues, and what is called the patrimony of St. Peter, in memory of which a piece of mosaic work was made and put up in the Pope's palace, representing St. Peter with 3 keys in his lap, signifying the 3 keys of the 3 parts of his patrimony, and to show his sovereignty over them. The Pope to this day wears a triple crown. That was true in Gill's day, and it is true today. What Gill is saying is that this plucking up of these 3 horns was memorialized in a mosaic and put up in the Pope's palace, and he describes that mosaic with the 3 keys in his lap. This is a confirmation that that prophecy was fulfilled at that time. Gill then says, and behold, in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man. In some monstrous births, Gill says, there have been eyes in the knees, and in the belly above the navel, but never was there such a monster as this, to have an horn and eyes in the horn. Horns some monsters have, but not eyes in them. These may design the pretended sanctity and religion of the Pope or Antichrist. By way of a side note, I would also include this concept of the all-seeing eye. which is prevalent today. We see it in every form of media. We see it in films, music videos. Wherever there's some kind of high-profile media presence, there are eyes. The all-seeing eye, or the one eye uncovered. This is a symbol, this monster with a horn, yet that horn is covered in eyes, looking everywhere. So as Gill says, these may design the pretended sanctity and religion of the Pope of Rome or Antichrist, who thought a beast would be thought to be a man, a religious creature, or his pretended modesty, humanity, and courtesy, when he is all the reverse. Think about the current Pope, Pope Francis, his pretended modesty, humanity, and courtesy. It was the same in Gill's day. It was the same when the Antichrist was slowly revealed. There was an act of modesty, of humanity, and courtesy. But Gill says, when he is all the reverse, or rather his insight into scriptures, he makes pretension, setting himself up as an infallible judge of them and of all controversies, though they seem better to design what he really has than what he pretends to, and may denote his penetration and sagacity, his craft and cunning, and sharp looking out to get power and dominion, temporal and spiritual. Once again, those are the trademarks of Antichrist, both temporal and spiritual power, under the guise of Christ. Gill continues, and his watchfulness to keep it. That is not encroached upon and took away from him, and also all means and instruments by which he inspects his own and others' affairs, particularly the order of the Jesuits, which are his eyes everywhere, spies in all kingdoms and courts. Let's underline that. All kingdoms and courts. Since 1929, when Mussolini and the Vatican signed a concordat, a treaty to reinstate Vatican City as a sovereign state, and the Pope, the sovereign emperor of that country, ever since that day, the papacy has signed concordats with every major nation on earth, and they have placed their Jesuits, their spies, as Gill says, in all the nations and all the courts. And Gill says of the Jesuits, the eyes of the Pope, and get intelligence of what is done in the councils and cabinets of princes. How many eyes this horn had is not said, nor is it easy to say how many the Pope of Rome has. He has many as Argus, and more too, and these sharp and piercing, and a mouth speaking great things, as that he is Christ's vicar on earth. Vicar is the English word for substitute. Substitute is the English word for anti. Anti is the Greek word. It means substitute. Substitute means vicar. Vicar means anti. The Pope takes the title, Vicar of Christ, Antichrist. He claims to be, as Gill says, Peter's successor, head of the church, and universal bishop, that he is infallible and cannot err, that he has all power in heaven and earth and hell, that he can forgive sin, grant indulgences, make new laws, and bind the consciences of men, dispense with the laws of God and men, dispose of kingdoms, and remove and set up kings at pleasure, with many others of the like kind. We'll end our study of Gill's commentary on Antichrist and the Fourth Kingdom. We'll pick this up next time around. Many thanks for listening, all my Patreon subscribers, and my fellow Bereans and like-minded YouTubers. God bless.